So next we have Nat.
Howdy, I am going to share my screen. Alrighty, and share the sound. All right. So before I get started, I wanted to just say a big thank you to the Girl Museum for sponsoring this project and hosting this project. I'm an independent scholar, so I was a little worried about running an interview series without any sort of institutional support, and they took me on, and I continue to be super duper appreciative of that. So yeah, playing with dead things, ethnographies of girlhood. I came to this project from my own feelings of girlhood. Hold on, there's a chat. Yay! So I am really I no longer identify as a girl, right? I've kind of left binary identities behind. But in working through my own queerness, I found that my younger self is still a little girl. I remember the first time my therapist asked me about my inner self, and he paused. He was like, "Does she use she her pronouns?" And I had to sit with it and think about it. And I was like, you know what? Like, yeah, she does. And that's interesting. Like, how is she still a little girl? And so as a researcher, naturally, whenever I have a question, I go do some reading. And I ran into Marnina Gonick's article where she asks the question, are queer girls girls? And that's kind of in the interest of complicating and creating a more complex category of girl. And it stuck with me a lot. I spent a lot of my girlhood feeling very monstrous, and hiding signs of queerness and fear of like violence. So are queer girls, whether or not it is proper or real to be a queer girl, there are people inhabiting that existence, right? Like, this comes from trans ideas of identity, of whether or not you are being granted access to that category by society, you can still inhabit it. So in that case, what does it mean to experience a queer girlhood? What is girlhood if it is not an age range, if it's not a genital configuration, if it is not in relationship to man, patriarchy, and boyhood, right? So my methodologies, this is an ethnography project. I knew what I thought, but embodiment is a really important principle to me, which is this idea that we all have our own individual ideas of what girlhood means to us. And so I wanted to kind of get a feel of the field. I hold a singular identity, and I was really curious about trans girlhoods. I was curious about who has chosen to leave girlhood and who has chosen to come to it, right? So I did an open call for interviews through the Girl Museum. We used their social media, and as part of that call, I made sure to include whatever girlhood means to you. I also did some direct reach out to people in my life who I know have interesting relationships with girlhood. That was really gratifying. It's really gratifying to bring the people you love into the archive. I'm actually really emotional about it still, of like, these people that I love have a permanent place in the archive now. For our interview questions, I had everybody fill out a form who wanted to be interviewed to kind of get a feel of making sure I hit a lot of different areas and get a very wide breadth of experience. So I kind of built off of what folks said in that. And then as far as goals for the interviews, my goal was to let people tell their stories. And I really emphasized that to everyone I spoke with, of like, this is your interview. We have this topic, but if there's something you want to talk about, like, we will talk about it. And they had, full veto power over everything that got published. So yeah, my 6 interviewees, I had Emily, Vic, Morgan, Percy, Andy, and Adrienne. We have a huge breadth of identity here. We have folks who identify as non-binary. We have folks who identify as transmasculine. We have folks who identify as cis and queer. We have trans women. So we really, really did hit this big breadth that I'm really excited about. So what we're going to do is I'm going to I have a short, like 30-second clip from each interview. These interviews are like an hour long each. So we're not going to get to talk about everything. When I started looking through my interviews, I drowned in information, which is a wonderful feeling. It is so nice to drown in information. But it also made it hard to squish into 15 minutes. All righty. So this first quote comes from my interview with Emily. Emily is an illustrator and a flight attendant and identifies as queer and is working through their gender identity. Where they're at right now, it feels weird. And so we were talking about kind of media that they enjoy and seeing gendered examples in media. And they were talking about cosplay and, wanting to cosplay different characters and have access to different forms of identification. So I'm going to go ahead and play this clip for us.
But I loved all of those things, and I was so frustrated with people telling me, no, you can only be one thing, you can only like one type of thing, you can't, like, it's unusual, and that frustrated me so much. So, and just, I think a lot of those feelings had to do with how society treats femininity in general. So I think being subjected at an early age to obvious misogyny, made me feel like I don't want to be subjected to this.
Yeah.
And I knew that no matter what I do, I'm going to be subjected to this.
So what Emily's talking about there is they were harassed a lot as a young girl, sexually harassed as walking down the street. And so they took on, the attempt to subvert the norm of girl. They tried. They were like, you know what? I'm going to, get a piercing and dye my hair so that they'll leave me alone. And what she found was that, like, even as she attempted to subvert that norm, because girl is seen as something kind of owned by patriarchy, right? And she couldn't get out because she was seen as a commodity. And that was really frustrating and kind of part of where this disconnect to femininity came from, of where all of these people are going to have these big assumptions about me and decide who I am and not see me as a person. They see me as an object that they can own, right? So this next quote comes from my interview with Vic. Vic is a screenwriter or a playwright and an actor, and he is trans masculine. And we were talking about, his build and like, what does it mean to, be raised a girl and then leave it and come to boyhood essentially. So we'll go ahead and play this clip.
Because I wanted to be high femme and I wanted to be kitchen, I wanted to be camp.
I love it.
And it's like that wouldn't have been granted to me if I was a little boy. And yeah, like this build that I have now, this is what I want. I cannot imagine having any other, build. And like genuinely, I get really emotional sometimes thinking about the girl that I grew up being, because like she had some stuff to figure out, but she was trying real hard. And like I in the last couple of years.
I adore this clip. I think my favorite thing about it is the way that it subverts the wrong body narrative, or this idea of like false embodiment that we see a lot when talking about trans folks, of this idea of being born into the wrong body, and that, the only way to change your gender is to completely realign yourself in a perfect box. And what Vic is talking about here is this subversion and like this dedication to true embodiment of, like the things that were granted to me in girlhood were important to me, and they made me who I am, and that doesn't negate any of the realness of who I am now or who I was then. And that's so important, and I love that it lets embodiment be kind of playful and a thing that lets you access all kinds of different stuff. Alrighty, so then this next clip comes from my interview with Morgan. Morgan is a researcher as well, and she researches girls in like girl literature, so things like the Babysitters Club. And we were talking about growing up. Something that was really important to me, that felt important to girlhood, was relationships between girls, specifically relationships between girls when there are no adults or boys around, this kind of secrecy. And yeah, so let's go ahead and listen to this clip.
There's nothing that can really replicate that. And again, behind closed doors, it was like makeup, it was gossiping, it was like, what do you think it'd be like to be kissed? Or like, sometimes it'd be really bold and like, like, oh, I wonder if he has a big penis. Like, we had no frame of reference. Like, you had no idea what any of that meant, but it was just like we were so growing up. Or like, we'd watch a movie and like be like, what do you think that would be like? Or, it was just sort of like the working through ideas and talking them through with someone that like, those kind of like weird questions that we all have, but we don't want to ask out loud because it's like, what a weirdo, but like I had my best friends to ask those questions too. So.
I love this clip. It's really thinking about like those relationships between girls, which are very close. There's a lot of research about like romantic relationships in girlhood. Looking into the history of chumming and schoolgirl romance. And thinking about how like it lets us experiment, it lets us try things on. And I found that this showed up a lot in my interviews, and this idea of experimenting and trying things on. And it ended up being something that, as I redefined girlhood for myself, was really integral to that. My next clip comes from Percy. You'll remember earlier we talked about being a demi-girl in the first presentation. Percy as well identifies as a demi-girl, and I was asking them about, the choice to stay affiliated essentially with girlhood in choosing the label demi-girl. So let's go ahead and listen to this clip.
Oh, I still present very femininely and engage in a lot of feminine things, like dressing very like high femme, and I do feel tied to certain aspects of femininity, not necessarily in a girlish way per se, but the aspects of femininity that I feel more closely tied to are like I guess like Black Widow, Jessica Rabbit type archetype of like very high femme, can and will kill you. So I do still feel tied to those aspects, but not all of them, I suppose.
This is something that came up a lot as well, this idea of like being more drama than woman, more character than woman. A lot of, especially like Vic, when I talked to him about his experiences in the theater, this idea of like, I want to play characters that are more drama than woman, came up a lot, which was really interesting. This next clip comes from my friend Andy. They are a poet, an incredible poet who writes about girlhood often. And here we're talking about what happens after you kind of break out of girlhood.
Real joy in like being out of that box, doing the really hard work of breaking it, and then coming out the other side and being like, well, I am still like a beautiful feminine person, and like all the things I loved about myself as a girl are still true. They're just like free. I can just go wherever I want with that energy. And like, yeah, so I feel like the process of breaking down girlhood is like, you rip through it, and then you come out the other side and it's not holding you back anymore. It's just there.
I love this clip. We're going to come back to this in a minute. Thinking about girlhood as a liminal space that can be accessed. And what I really love about this is like this breaking of girlhood, what's left over is something you can choose to access, right? So this last clip comes from Adrienne, who is a trans woman who works as a therapist with domestic violence victims, talking about what it means to be her own creator and come to girlhood on purpose.
Because when I approach femininity, I approach it very intentionally. It's about compassion. It's about connection. It's about empathy. It's about showing up from those traditionally feminized roles of care and nurturance. And how do I embody that intentionally? Not just the forced into this box because the patriarchy says you have to be a servant to men and children and culture, but I choose to be a healer. And that's been very empowering. It's been very affirming gender-wise too. I think being my own creator has been really powerful as a trans person, as a trans woman, because
I get to choose the pieces of gender that I like, and I get to leave everything else behind. I don't want to be.
Alrighty, so girlhood as kind of where I ended up with all these incredible interviews is kind of thinking of girlhood as a dead thing, something that me personally, I've broken out of, I've broken. And because it's a dead culture almost for me, I'm able to kind of go back and like pick up the pieces that are important to me, like Adrienne said, and like Andy said, of being able to come back to it and kind of pick up pieces and examine them, as well as a liminal space, kind of breaking down the idea of identity as something that is knowable and fixed. Think about Riley Norton in Black on Both Sides, think about it instead as a liminal space that anyone can access, right? Like girlhood is something anyone can access, whether or not they have ever considered themselves or been considered a girl. I think of it as a way of connecting, a way of forming relationships, and also an experiment and breaking the rules, a place to try things on and get to know yourself.
So
yeah.
We are
Yes.
at time.
I'm at time. Thank you so much. Special thanks to the Girl Museum again. And there's my email on screen if you have any questions.